Finally, after all these years, I've found complete, foolproof evidence of cryptids. Bigfoot, Wendigo, Mothman. They are real.
And now you can do battle with them against friends and foes alike. Cryptid is available for pre-order right now. Go to cryptidcardgame.com to pre-order today, or go to eeriecast.store. To make shipping and keeping stock easier on our small team, we'll be shipping Cryptid in rounds. In this pre-order round, orders received before October 1st, 2024 will ship by October 31st, 2024. Now get out there and prepare to make your werewolf eat your friend's skinwalkers and all that.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Look, my specialty is serving burnt bean water and sneaking a bite of the croissants before they get to the customers. You're not gonna find me dead working anywhere near a dark and eerie reservation, especially after the particular stories I've heard. Hey, it's my break, so how's about I share them with you right now? Stories about that, as well as terrifying tales from a taxi driver, a marine, and more. These are tales from the break room. By the way, you should go read the new EerieCast novel about a terrifying cabin trip and the legendary Wendigo. It's called Lore by Barry Napier. You can find it on Amazon, or go to eeriecast.com/lore, or listen to the audiobook exclusively on eeriecast.com/plus as a member. Thank you. A rough night as a guard. From NightShine. Late night security is no different than any other late night gig. It's pretty simple, really. Just unarmed security at a gas station, next to a casino, by the border, overnight. Usually the shift is pretty uneventful. Honestly, there's more to do and more to look for during the odd time I was put on days. Nights, though, were once my safe haven to get away from the hustle of the tedious everyday. Soon found me questioning whether or not my particular site was something I should abandon. I'm not a weak man by any means. I've seen my fair share of gruesome, grotesque, and even brutal things. I found myself in some pretty less than favorable situations, down the business end of a few, shall we say, cordless hole punchers. And being smack dab by the border of New York and Canada, my shifts usually included the occasional visit from the Border Patrol, or DEA. Then again, also being on reservation land constitutes a whole new host of rules altogether. Not that these guys are coming in and monitoring my little bitty gas station for the next kingpin or anything. They're in and out, filling their gas tanks or grabbing a few snacks before continuing on with their own shifts. My shifts tend to be boring. In my line of work, boring is the best thing you could wish for. No paperwork, no reports, no cops, and no Yahoo with a hole puncher looking to turn the place into the northern version of the OK Corral. The drunks are easy. These guys or gals would hobble in after a long night of drinking and betting at the casino. They would use the restroom and buy themselves something to snack on before taking off. Not often does one cause too much of a ruckus, though there was that one party bus, about 25 people all hammered beyond belief. Puke and urine all over the place. I pitied the poor soul that had to clean it all up. But hey, as long as no one was stealing or getting violent, I was more than entertained by the slack-jawed circus that played out in front of me. Now, the tweakers, they're not as easy to deal with. I'd even take it a step further and say they're a downright pain in my butt. They're the most prone to trying to make off with something without paying for it, or the most likely to do their best impression of being possessed by the devil himself. They're even likely to try some underhanded deal right in front of me, as if I'm oblivious to the very clear baggie that just changed hands for a couple of 20s and maybe a 50. But what are you gonna do? The best I can do in that situation is take off my house shoe and chase them off. One night I stood at my small podium, watching the last lingering souls drain out of the parking lot. I was mentally preparing myself for yet another eventless night. Technically, I'm always supposed to stand up straight and alert. Makes the client feel safe, one of my supervisors had told me, before I was ever assigned to this location. I took to leaning on a small podium-shaped display for lottery tickets. Keeps the pressure off my back and the aches off my feet. You'd think having memory foam insoles would help, but you'd be amazed at how quickly they wear out. The cashiers usually mingle about or float around aimlessly behind the registers around this time. There's not much for them to do outside of tidying up and counting their drawers. I've caught them in their little rebellious routine, sneaking naps in the back room or on breaks. The last guy they had doing security was none too keen on that, but I figured as long as the active register had an attendee, then all fine by me. There is a guy though. One guy that my handoff supervisors gave me a bit of a heads up on. He's not exactly playing with a full deck, if you catch my drift. Not sure if he ever was. This guy looks harmless, confused even, usually sporting gray sweatpants, slippers, and a black t-shirt. He has a low buzz cut and something of a stubbly beard. He never really made frequent appearances at my bitty station, but when he did, the man brought with him the heebie-jeebies. He would just stare right past the sliding automatic doors and straight into the station. Not at anyone or anything in particular. Phil, I think his name was. Or at least that's what the girls at the station called him. His presence never bothered me during the swing day shifts. But the nights, I kept an eye on him. You ever get that feeling that something was watching you, but you can't quite figure out from where? Yeah, that's Phil. His dead-eye gaze. One night, Phil decided to ramp things up a notch. The night was already pretty quiet for a Friday, but the all-too-familiar sound of squad car sirens could be heard just up the street. The girls seemed a little off that night, too. They kept looking at the sliding doors of the station with a type of anxious anticipation that was unusual for them. The manager on duty had asked me to bump up my foot patrols from once every hour to once every half hour. I obliged and marked it down in the site log before grabbing my walkie-talkie and starting the stroll through the lot and around the building. Once outside, I got a better look at all the commotion down the street. Come to find out, it wasn't just one squad car, but 4 of them, and an ambulance. The officers' body language didn't exactly fill me with confidence that whatever they were responding to had a happy ending. "What's going on out there?" the manager, Sarah, asked over the radio. At first, I didn't say anything, as I was still trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing, and if I had to worry about locking down the station. 4 cop cars and an EMT, it looks like. None of them look happy. I finally responded. I kept my eyes on the scene before me. I felt a cold chill run up my spine, like someone just walked over my grave. Without moving too fast, I raised my walkie. "Has anyone seen our favorite tweaker tonight? I'm worried about him." I tried to joke, but my voice held apprehension. I thought I might know the answer, but I hoped I was wrong. "He hasn't been around for at least a day or so. You think he's involved?" Sarah chimed in. I didn't respond straight away, but instead, I turned my attention just off to the left of the scene. I caught a glimpse of someone slinking off toward the alley. "Hold on," I said, finally answering. I'd moved to get closer to the scene, but I knew in the back of my mind if I ventured too far from my post, Road Patrol Management would have my badge inside of an hour. At the corner, I stood, eyes squinted, attempting to see through the flashing red and blue lights and the decently bright streetlights. Nothing moved. With a step back, I glanced at the station to check, and again, nothing. "What's wrong?" Sarah crackled, scaring the bejesus out of me. I thought I saw something," I answered back. Sarah, being as beloved and sarcastic as she could ever be, responded with a simple, "Don't do that." With a chuckle, I rolled my eyes. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I knew my area was known for occasionally being sketchy, but This couldn't have been more than a wellness check gone astray. "All right, I'm coming back. No sense in me sticking my nose where it wasn't invited," I told Sarah on the radio. As I turned to start heading back, I walked headfirst into none other than Phil. But Phil was in quite a state. His black t-shirt was tattered. His sweatpants were stained in a deep shade of red that to the untrained eye looked black in the dim light. Phil greeted me with a wide smile that reeked of malice and wicked anticipation. For the first time in months, I kept an eye on him. There was a clarity in his eyes that set off every alarm bell a human mind could possibly have. He didn't look confused and dazed or glossy-eyed like he usually did. Sizing him up, I knew that if there were no surprises, I could take him. I could toss him right over my shoulder if I wanted to. However, some little voice in the back of my mind screamed that was a very bad idea. Without a word, I raised my hand as if showing him I had nothing on me that I could use to hurt him or pose too much of a threat. His wide smile faltered as he eyed the walkie-talkie clipped to my belt, and for a split second, I swore I saw the makings of a scowl. I prayed to whatever god would be listening tonight. I slowly lowered my right hand down to my belt, then brought the device up to clear eye level. That flicker of a scowl told me all I needed to know about the boat that I found myself in, and the last thing I needed was the situation going from hazardous to fatal. With the same slow, careful pace, I brought my left hand down to the volume knob and turned it all the way down. Thankfully, the radio was an old off-brand Radio Shack model, so the display light was hard to see, even in pitch-black conditions. But to stay on the safe side, I kept the display palmed in my hand, just in case my gambit was a little too obvious to spot. As if showing him that I indeed turned it off, I clicked the talk button 4 distinct times, and 4 more times after that. By then, I had to rely on hope that Sarah paid attention to the nonverbal signals I've shown her over the last few months, and what to do if I ever used one. Phil seemed satisfied with the silence of my radio, but gestured again to the bushes he had hidden in earlier. "Toss it," he said calmly. I didn't bother arguing. I gave the radio a heft just shy of where he wanted it. That scowl flickered on his face again, and with one quick motion he brought his foot down on the thing hard enough for it to crack. When he brought his heel down on the radio again, I'd taken what I thought was an unnoticed step back. But the reaction that spurred from Phil told me how wrong I was. In an instant, he snapped his attention back to me, then brandished a hammer. He had hidden it in his sweatpants, I quickly tried to guess, but also dismissed the thought as my mind began to wonder if I was going to be granted the gift of a rather harsh headache. His eyes lit up as he watched me freeze. "What? Scared of a silly little thing like this?" he taunted, waving the hammer as if it were nothing more than a kid's toy. His jovial sarcasm irked me, but I'd figured if I tried to rush him, the back of my head would be mimicking a split melon in an instant. So instead I shook my head slightly. "Just wondering what other rabbits you're about to pull from that hat," I responded, trying to create a bit of levity. Phil smirked. "Enough to make my night easy, and yours especially difficult." "My night is always rough when you show up," I grumbled. "Can't ever tell if you're off your meds, or just a flat-out whack job." Phil tilted his head, as if thinking. "You're stalling," he said, plainly, as his expression became unreadable. And just like that, fight or flight had kicked itself into full alert. With no warning whatsoever, he wildly swung the sharp side of his hammer. On an instinct, from the many previous tangles I've been in over the years, I raised my left arm to block it. But that was a mistake I very quickly paid for. The claw head of the hammer bit into my forearm and dug in. I let out a pained shout attempting to pull it out with my other hand. However, Phil yanked it out and went for another swing. This time I ducked it and rammed my shoulder into his gut, attempting to tackle him to hold him down. To my surprise, I succeeded in my half-cocked counter. When we hit the ground, Phil let out a surprised yelp, but very quickly swung that hammer again, this time connecting with my side. Thankfully, though it hurt like heck, nothing broke. Having rolled on top of him, I reared back and gave him a right to the temple that would have made Mike Tyson himself proud. This seemed to anger him pretty bad, as instead of swinging at me with the hammer again, he went to press his thumbs into my eyes. My answer to the attempt at my eyesight was another vicious right hook, and another, then one more for good measure. I'd hoped to knock him out, but instead he simply submitted. In our scuffle, I'd failed to see the two officers approaching with their weapons drawn. It dawned on me how the situation looked, and before either of the officers said a word, I got off of my seemingly subdued attacker and placed my hands behind my head. After that, things went by in a blur. But I do recall seeing Sarah explain to the officers what had happened, and even urging them to the station's back room to review the security camera footage. Sarah even explained that it was I who signaled her to gather the authorities after the sequence of beeps I sent through the walkie-talkie. It was unknown to me at the time that she had responded to my signal at all, but apparently she had clicked her talk button twice, a way of saying, "I understand." Not surprising, though, was hearing that a couple of the other cashiers had recorded the ordeal from their phones. With a new understanding, the officers, instead of detaining me, urged me to seek medical attention for the weeping gash in my arm. I agreed, given that I'd started losing feeling in that arm altogether. I figured Phil caught a good cluster of nerves, and I didn't notice during the fray. Or maybe I lost a little too much blood for comfort. Either way, I found myself in the back of an EMS vehicle, being tended to and urged to take the next couple of days off work to recover. I went for a checkup the following day just to be sure. The good news was the damage was all fairly temporary. The wound from my left arm would heal normally, but the trade-off would be when it gets humid or stormy, I'd feel an ache again. Instead of cracked or fractured ribs, I made off with only a bruise that healed within a few days. I put in my 2 weeks' notice to the higher-ups about 3 months later, concluding my 1.5-year-long service as an unarmed security officer. Through Sarah, though, I found out that Phil was indeed responsible for the initial police response that night, because 4 people had been bludgeoned to a pulp in their apartment, and then another 3 were found in the hallway leading out. According to Sarah, I was pretty lucky I caught him off guard. Running into him the way I did was a surprise to us both. I always knew something was off about Phil, and I have a bad feeling I haven't seen the last of him. Possessed Soldier Oldberg, from Rory R. I was 20 years old, attending basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, in the summer of 2011. The process of MEPS, or the Military Entrance Processing Station for civilians, ended up being around 17 days. In that time, I learned a lot about people, and I made some connections with soldiers who I would go on to basic training with, friends who are lifelong and close to me still today. A story all of us recall, one which holds a mythological place in my heart, is the story of Jonathan Oldberg. This story took place at MEPS, which brings me back to the point of bringing it up in the first place. MEPS is the first time you and all the other new US Army recruits are together, sleeping in barracks, standing in formations, getting shots, and doing basic in-processing junk. A lot of times, MEPS is the stepping your toe into the military life of being told how to jump, how high to jump, when to jump, no sir, yes sir, all that. Needless to say, this is the first place where prospective soldiers bail, raise their hands, refuse to go on, finding themselves out processing before they've even started the in-processing. It's not beyond a new soldier to act mental in order to be classified as not fit for service, but usually it's broken down to finally fessing up or straightening out and figuring your junk out. Throughout the days, though, whispering and rumors of Oldberg's strange behavior became more and more known. Bunkmates to the left and right of him would claim stories of the young 19-year-old rambling in the night, talking to himself in whispers. These whispers would last through the entire night, as fire guards, which are 2 soldiers on guard in the night that rotate on shift hourly, would take note. This means that through the night, sometimes 10 different soldiers would mention their strange encounter hearing Oldberg or seeing him act differently. Boredom helped spur my interest in this encounter, and throughout the first few days I delighted in hearing different weird run-ins. Like Oldberg staring at a walking patrol guard, walking past his bunk in the middle of the night. Maybe around 2 a.m., 4 a.m., it didn't really matter what time. If he was faking, he was committed to the role at all hours of the day, something that really stood out early to me. By nighttime, we were all so tired, we'd take any extra minutes of sleep gladly. I remember approaching Oldberg, saying hello during some free time at the barracks after lunch. I approached the small 5'6" soldier, who, soaking wet, could not have been over 130 pounds. His pale white skin gave him a ghostly appearance. Talking to him, he seemed like a normal, soft-spoken kid. He was well-mannered, polite, more shy than anything. I thought he was harmless. The stories must be bored soldiers ganging up on the new kid. A story as old as time, really. How could I get lost believing in gossip, or even entertaining the thought? That thought would change drastically throughout the next few days. My first run-in with Oldberg's strangeness came with my second shift of fire guard. This took place on day 4 of MEPS. My bunkmate Brian and I woke up at 1:55, 5 minutes before my shift had to start. I got dressed, put on my shoes, and was at the fire guard desk in minutes. The shift went by, boring and quiet. Soft snores and rumbles of sleeping soldiers lined the wide spaces of the darkened barracks bay. Brian and I made small talk while we passed the time. The moonlight gave the corridor an eerie glow. Being around 60 bodies in one room gives you a sense of security, though, that at least if something does come up, there's enough of you and your fellow soldiers to deal with the threat. I walked and patrolled the darkened bay, making sure not to wake these sleeping soldiers with my steps. I felt it was practice for being a sneaky infantryman, a skill I would definitely need someday, I assured myself. I passed by bunk bed to bunk bed all the way to one end of the bay and into the bathrooms, which, unlike the darkened bay, was almost overwhelmingly bright. I took a leak, washed my hands, and grabbed my L-shaped flashlight, leaving on the opposite side of the bathroom, which would put me on the last leg of my patrol, on a racetrack-shaped bed bunk situation, where the middle remains open, if that makes sense. When I got about a quarter of the way down, I heard a small scratching sound. I paused my walk and listened intently. The noise was coming from a few bunks up. I walked slowly, making sure not to make a single noise. The closer I got to the target of what I perceived the sound to be coming from, I realized it was coming from a bottom bunk. The moonlight perfectly bounced off the open bay windows, lighting up the white sheets that were covering a soldier. The sheet wrapped tightly over the small body, as if someone was pulling it downwards through the bed. When my eyes focused onto the lips of the featureless apparition, I realized the sound I was hearing wasn't scratching at all. It was a sound coming from this soldier's mouth. It was whispering. Quiet but violent whispering. Almost a chant. I stood there dumbfounded, not knowing what to do. What was this noise? Is this kid okay? Should I wake him up? I simply just stood there for what seemed like minutes. My focus was broken by the bunkmate next to him rolling over and looking at me. The "what the heck" he mouthed to me seemed to match my exact same reaction. The other bunk on the other side rolls over as well to acknowledge his nervousness or fear of the situation too. The fact that this was keeping people up in the middle of the night only angered me. So I smacked the side of the bed with my unlit light and said, "Hey, shut up! People can't sleep!" With the loud ding of the metal of my light and the harshness in my tone, the whispering stopped and the mouth stopped moving. The soldiers on both sides of me gave me a nod of approval and a thumbs up. I'd done my job. Best fire guard ever, I thought in my head, as I strolled back to the fire guard desk, which was now lit up. I glanced back before breaking sight, though. I looked at the still illuminated Oldberg, whose face was covered by the sheet. I could swear he was smiling through the tightly pulled cloth. I shook my head, walking back to Brian, who was chatting up the next fire guard shift. When I told them about what I'd seen, Brian cut me off and told me the noise got louder and louder when I left, which is why he turned his light on. The other guard excitedly told me about some weird circumstances of his shift the other night. Details I forgot, but it made me think maybe we're all just wired up and looking for excitement. Some of us create it, some of us like the show. Anyway, it wasn't enough to make me lose sleep yet, although I couldn't get the side of that face profile out, draped by the tight cloth. I mean, who slept like that? What game was he playing? I bet to myself he'd break down and quit the next morning, dropping whatever facade he was playing into. The next day came up, and beyond my surprise, Oldberg had no idea. He had no clue at all that he had been acting strangely the previous night. He quickly became the topic of small-time gossip. Every soldier quickly had input on their favorite weird, creepy Oldberg moment. Despite the weirdness at night, Oldberg seemed normal. He talked shyly, never really divulged much about himself, and even seemed to try and make friends. I remember a soldier, Boyer, trying to befriend him, and even deciding to take up the top bunk of Oldberg, showing solidarity with someone who seemed to be lonely. Boyer would even defend Oldberg, hushing stories and testimony from the rest of the soldiers, saying it's just people creating excitement at the expense of poor Oldberg. This would not last long, as day by day more stories came along. Even Boyer had his own run-ins sleeping above the ghostly apparition, although he never added to the stories and would never update us on what he'd seen. But I know he experienced something strange or grave, as he would quickly change the subject, or comment on how strange everything was, like a man fed up with finding information he no longer wanted to see. Boyer moved his bed and stuff far away from Oldberg, and pretty soon, the bed to the left and right of Oldberg followed suit. My next run-in would occur about 7 days into in-processing. By now, everyone knew each other roughly, and we all rushed to fill the empty time with working out and talking about whatever we could to fill the long days. My next fire guard shift came up, and once again, Brian and I sat at the desk, joking and talking about whatever. Coincidentally, we joked about ghost stories, spooky things we'd seen as kids. We chuckled and laughed in the dark bay, our only light source being the moonlight in the windows and the green exit sign. Besides this, we had our L-shaped flashlights that, at the time, we both had turned off. The room grew silent. Even snoring seemed to cease. The darkness in the room seemed to grow, like the clouds had decided to block the moon now, only leaving the green exit light as our only light source in the now growingly spooky room. Staring into the blackened bay, I heard movement. I focused my eyes and couldn't see, so I moved to the front of the fire guard desk. Brian sat up in his chair suspiciously. A small dragging sound came from the middle of the bay floor. In the kill zone, a portion of the floor reserved for drill sergeants, a spot where soldiers knew not to walk. Then complete silence. Just as I was about to break the long silence, A figure sprints at me from the dark. A pale white Oldberg stops abruptly about 5 meters away from me. I met his incoming pace with the rays of my L-shaped light like I was waiting for a fastball pitch. A violent smile beamed across the soldier's face as he stood strangely with his hands and limbs outward stretched. "Oldberg, I'm gonna mess you up, man," I blasted out. There wasn't an ounce of hesitation. I was afraid of getting kicked out for trouble or causing a fight, but this was another level of concern. It seemed life or death. One step closer, and I was gonna tee off like Barry Bonds. The smile on Oldberg's face grew, and I now noticed his eyes were open. They'd been open the whole time, but I'd confused them for being closed. His pupils had turned back, and all that was visible were the whites of his eyes. He let out this weird giggle. "Get back to your bed, or I'm gonna mess you up, Oldberg. I'm not playing with you, man," I told him. Brian sat there petrified. Oldberg then backs up slowly into the darkness. Brian and I sat there staring at ourselves, just bearing witness to this situation. "What the heck was that?" Brian mentioned. His face was pale white. He looked scared, cluing to me that if I had fought Oldberg then and there, it was probably going to be a 1v1 with a demon. We woke up the next fire guard and explained the situation. They nodded their heads in agreement, ready to investigate, as Oldberg seemed to be the only thing anyone was guarding for at this point. We got up, and we went on down to where Oldberg slept. The darkness from the bay made the room seem incredibly long. We marched all 4 together to his bed. He lay facing away with the blanket covering his head completely, not moving, like nothing had ever happened. I remember making sure that the guard knew to wake me up if something crazy did happen. I no longer doubted any of the stories. Something was not right about Oldberg, and everyone at this point agreed. I wanted to be awake if anyone saw him moving strangely, almost like it was inevitable that something was going to happen. The next day was basic in processing, and at this point we were pretty much just hurrying up and waiting to transition to actual basic training. Halfway through the day, while I'm still sitting on my bed, I'm surprised by a familiar face. Oldberg, who seemed even more small and frail than normal, like his health had been deteriorating while he was here. He was standing there in front of me. "Hey, Rowans," his soft, timid voice bellowed out. What's up, Oldberg?" I replied. "I heard I went up to the guard desk and pissed you off last night. I'm so sorry. I don't even remember any of that, or why I'd go up to the desk," Oldberg stated. He apologized profusely and seemed genuinely sorry for the event. I didn't know how to treat the situation. I remember shaking his hand, telling him it's all good, and even making a joke about it. Something that I could tell relieved Oldberg. Despite his weirdness, he seemed like a genuine sweet person, like an only child who was out of his element, but just trying to make friends. There wasn't anything to dislike about Oldberg when he was himself, which is what made the whole thing even more strange. Every time he'd be included in the group or shown he's one of us, he'd get turned around the following morning, after a fire guard would catch him sleeping strangely or wandering in the showers, which happened to one of my other friends. He kept hearing something from the latrine. When he went to investigate, he found Oldberg propped against the shower wall, staring up with the biggest smile on his face, eyes rolled back just the same as I'd seen him. It sucked seeing the battle of him trying to be normal, paired with whatever illness or mental affliction that affected him. My last run-in with Oldberg would be the most significant of any run-in. I would be the grand finale in the showdown with Oldberg, a story that many of my old brothers talk about even today. Day 13, a day that came as normal as any. Brian and I sat on the desk once again, blabbing about random topics. Halfway through the shift, I heard some stirring around the dark zone, the area where 3 or so bunks had been emptied around Oldberg. Brian and I looked at each other as we kept hearing a bang, 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 bang. We both crept forward down the dark corridor. Light off at first, but soon enough we said F that and turned them both on. We made it to Oldberg's bed area, but he wasn't there. I shined the light under the bed, then on the top, and suddenly, bang. It came from the other side of his locker. I looked over, and I saw his legs there. He had himself propped up under the bay window, with his head banging back against the locker, creating that loud thud noise. "Oldberg," I whispered harshly. No response was made, other than another bang against the wall. I looked closer, and sure enough, his eyes were rolled backwards again. "Hey!" I yelled out, not trying to get any closer. His mouth opened, and whispers chant out, just like the first day. But this time, it was louder, more distinct. The sharpness and highness of his tone was inhuman, and reminded me of the red rum moment in The Shining, when Danny keeps screaming the phrase. This started to awake the other soldiers, who began to dress and wander over. "Get the next shift," I told Brian. He ran across the bay while I sat there staring at this entity. I listened closer. What was it he was chanting? Soon I heard some familiar words. He was speaking Latin, it seemed. Not that my Latin is decent. I just remember the way it sounded, and this was by far not a normal language. When the next 2 soldiers showed up, they'd already made themselves prepared for the situation. Everyone was ready for some Oldberg confrontation, and this was it seemed. "Oldberg," I yelled. His chant grew louder. Me and 3 other soldiers moved in closer, surrounding him. His language grew more demonic and harsh. Then he makes a statement, and right as he says it, it all ends. And bam, the bay window, which was 8 feet up and definitely unreachable by any of us, especially Oldberg, bangs loudly 3 times. This noise makes all of us jump, and the other soldiers in the bay began to murmur in confusion. This was a paranormal situation. There was no way around it. No way in heck he could play this role so well. And the noise at the window cemented this. We were on the 2nd floor, and that window lays at least 20 feet off the ground. Oldberg's Latin proceeds again, louder and louder. He's shouting, to the point of uncontrollable yelling. I told Brian to get the drill sergeant on guard, as this is beyond us. While he's gone, the other soldiers began to panic. Was Oldberg stroking out? Was he possessed? I needed an answer. Pain is the best cleanser for any act, I thought. Paired with a surprise, it could break anyone's act. I reached back and slapped Oldberg so hard in the face mid-chant. He stopped chanting and stared right at me. But his smile grew wider, more monstrous. Taken aback by my effort to get him to stop, my colleague's surprise grew. The fact I could wallop him so well, and not one hesitation in the act or even a moment of "ow, that hurt," cemented it even more. There was no helping this kid, I thought. We need an exorcist. Just then, an angry drill sergeant's voice broke through the darkness. I pointed, and the drill breaks character by going, "What the F?" He orders all of us to get back in bed, while he and another drill pick Oldberg up and pull him to the medical center outside the bay. What the F was right. I'm surprised how anyone could fall asleep after that event. I think most of us stayed up. Morning came and Oldberg wasn't to be seen again. From what I heard, he kept going at it like that until dawn. Rumors abound that they had to sedate him as he was unable to wake up from his trance. His locker was emptied out by the hospital staff, and that was the last we'd seen of old Jonathan Oldberg. We would only be there at in-processing for a few more days, but the stories of Oldberg would persist all the way throughout basic and through deployments, and even when I linked back up with old friends from the service days. It would not be the last mention I'd heard of him, though. About 2 months into basic, we were scheduled to get our dress blues tailored at the MEPS in-processing center. It was cool seeing the area again, especially after being this close to being done with basic and getting ready to head into infantry AIT, or Advanced Individual Training. At a certain point, I had to use the latrine, so I go to the restroom, and while I'm taking a leak, I hear 2 soldiers talking. "Yo, did you hear about Oldberg last night? They found him going through empty barracks, screaming and crap. They can't figure out what to do with him while he outprocesses." "Yeah, that guy's a freak," the other says. It blew my mind that he was still here, still terrorizing soldiers and drill sergeants alike. My guess is they knew something was extremely wrong with him, and after all the mental trials and tribulations, they realized he had to be put somewhere, maybe an asylum or something. Despite his condition, Oldberg was nothing but friendly and deeply wanted to be a soldier. At least it seemed in my eyes. This story is about 13 years old now, and I can recall the tone in his voice, the way it seemed almost alien. The way his face lit up with the sheet draped over it the first time I saw him. I hope Oldberg found peace and is living a happy life around good people. I hope he doesn't suffer from whatever he was suffering through. That situation was far from normal, though, and it's one of the things that have cemented the supernatural in my own life. I hope I never have to find out if he escaped his affliction or if he's even alive now. He might be angry from the slap that night. At least I hope to never find out. Stories of a taxi driver. From Strawberry Girl. My dad worked as a taxi driver for 10 years, transporting drunk university students back to their accommodation or taking elderly ladies to their bingo night. He's taken many people on many journeys up and down the country. As such, he's gone through several supernatural experiences. I'll tell you a few of his stories, told to me as a kid. Around 2 years of taxiing, he had a job that paid quite well. It was a simple, straightforward job. He had to pick up a group of middle-aged women and drive them to a local restaurant. It was a dark Friday night and they were celebrating their friend's 47th birthday. They were excited and a little tipsy. He told me that these jobs are usually the easiest jobs, the ones where you can talk to the customers, revel in their excitement, or hear their life stories. The journey was a long one, being around half an hour. The destination was set on the edge of a cliff, looking towards the sea. As they neared the restaurant, their surroundings became enveloped in heavy fog. The fog eclipsed nearby signs and blurred traffic lights. My dad needed to exercise caution, and so he slowed down, relying more on his sat-nav for guidance. He looked around and found the usually busy roads empty. This was unusual, but he blamed it on the weather. Nevertheless, he continued with the journey, determined to complete the journey so he could pick up more customers before going home for the night. However, the more my dad drove, the thicker the fog. While talking to one of the ladies in the passenger seat, he noticed that his sat-nav started to flash, seemingly turning off and on, froze on the road they were on. So he turned it off and continued as he knew this area like the back of his hand. However, even being ripped out of the stand wouldn't stop the screen from flashing, illuminating the windshield and almost blinding my dad. It was a dark night after all, and the flashes were enough to cause little white spots that linger after blinking. Annoyed, he simply threw it in the cup holders and kept driving. As he got closer to the destination, he began to notice a bright white glow coming from the distance on the left side. As they were near the beach, he initially dismissed it, thinking he was coming up on a lighthouse or a nearby ship. He paid it no mind, even as the light shone brighter and grew larger, taking over the left side of his windshield. Soon, the pleasant conversation between the ladies slowed and stopped altogether, with concerned mutters taking their place. "What is that?" some of them gasped, mouths agape. The extroverted and friendly woman in the passenger seat, who had been talking to my dad the entire way there, turned into a statue, staring into the distance. She told my dad to slow down, as she thought someone was walking in the road. As they approached the alleged figure, they all saw where the bright light was coming from. A pale gray man in tattered Victorian clothes, holding a lantern, walked across the road, mere meters away from the car. The scary part? My dad said they were so shocked at someone walking on the road and how bright the light was, it took a few seconds to register that the man had no legs. Instead, they saw him gliding across the road. My dad said he doesn't know how he got to the restaurant so quickly after that, but he knew that he probably broke a few traffic laws by speeding all the way there. The most notable part of that event, though, was how affected the customers were. Once a bubbly, excited, and tipsy bunch, they were now silent, shocked, and subdued. I do wonder what they told their friends upon arrival, if they told anyone at all. I'll tell you another story, one that I was, partially at least, witness to. It was November, on a chilly night. My dad at this point was a seasoned taxi driver, having worked half a decade in the profession. Despite a few shaky experiences, nothing really fazed him anymore. It was close to the end of his shift, around 10 p.m., and the jobs available had dried up. He decided to go home, seeing as though my mother and I were waiting up for him so we could have dinner together. It was on his way home that a notification popped up on his meter. A job. And it wasn't too far from home, so he figured he would complete the short trip and come straight home. It was a relatively straightforward trip, a 10-minute journey from a club to a residential block of flats. He quickly drove to the pickup location, which was quite populated. He messaged the passenger that he had arrived, and he waited. The passenger said that they were walking to the car. He scanned the crowd of partygoers lined up outside of the club, and the stragglers waiting on the curb. He couldn't see anyone walking towards him. Then suddenly, he saw her. A long-haired young woman, dressed in a long black dress and heeled boots. Her hair partially covered her face, masking her eyes and part of her mouth. My dad felt uneasy, as she had not come from the club. Instead, she had come from an adjacent alleyway across from it. As far as he knew, that alleyway led nowhere. It was a dead end, so he couldn't figure out where she could have come from. There were various clubs lining the busy street, and she didn't come from any of them. Despite this, she waved at him and walked over to the taxi. My dad said as soon as she opened the door, he felt a cold chill run up his spine. It just felt wrong to be in the presence of this woman. He tried to play it cool. After all, this was his last job, and he was going home right after. He began to drive to the destination, and she didn't say anything. Instead, she appeared to be picking at the skin of her palm. Halfway through the taxi ride, she spoke for the first time. She had this high-pitched, eerily childlike voice.
"Can you drop me off at a certain point, please? I couldn't get the location right on the app."
My dad, still feeling uneasy, nodded and followed her instructions, driving to a different part of town, more towards a set of shops. The closer they got to these shops, the more he felt dizzy, nausea gripping his body. He struggled to make it to the place she indicated. Once they arrived, he asked which shop she wanted to be dropped off at. The woman, still picking at her palm and avoiding eye contact, pointed to the furthest shop at the end of the street. He drove there slowly, trying not to throw up. The car, he told me later, began to smell like burning the closer they got. Eventually, he couldn't stand it anymore. He told her that he was dropping her off there, and she could walk the rest of the way. Despite him being quite blunt, she was fine with it, thanking him and leaving the taxi. She did do one thing, however. When she said thank you, she gripped his shoulder. Her hand was stone cold, and her nails dug into his skin slightly. My dad felt the worst at this point. He described it as worse than simply feeling nauseous. It was more like something inside him was trying to claw itself out of his throat. His hackles were raised, but when the woman left the taxi at last, the feeling stopped altogether. His shoulders, previously raised to his ears, lowered. His car began to smell normal again. He panicked, however. When he looked at the shop she wanted to go to, he realized something. She said earlier that she lived above a flat above the shop. My dad turned completely cold as he looked at the aforementioned shop and saw that there was no first floor. It was a ground floor shop. In fact, none of the shops on that street had a second floor. All of them were ground floors. He immediately drove home in a panic, shouting like mad as he entered the house. My mother and I tried to calm him, but he was convinced he had met something supernatural that night. Something evil. Thankfully, he left the taxi trade. He now works a less stressful job. To all the taxi drivers out there, I hope you're wary of the last customer you take, because they may not be human. The Ride-Along. From Mattoman. I went on a ride-along with a state trooper a while back. An old bird, about ready to retire. He was Navajo and grew up on the reservation, spending the first 8 years of his career as a Navajo reservation officer. He had enough stories from that to write at least 3 books, but one story he told me gave me chills. We were driving up the canyon at about 4 a.m., darkness all around us. Since he told me he was a Navajo officer, I knew that they had dealt with some strange things before, so I thought I'd ask about it. "You mean paranormal stuff?" he said. "Yeah," I answered, sheepishly. He then blew my mind. Here's the story. There was a boarded-up gas station out into the res about 3 hours away from other bits of civilization. The type of place where the attendant lived in an apartment above the station. It was so remote. It was long abandoned. We were tasked to check it out from time to time, making sure there were no squatters or vandals camping out. The place was located in a little basin, and the road to get there was somewhat steep, requiring hairpin turns to get down onto its level. It was about 1 a.m., and as I was at the top looking down at the gas station, I noticed a person wearing all black behind the gas station. He clearly noticed me and started to walk away. I called it down to dispatch and began my descent down the hairpin turns. As I got to the station, I saw him still walking away. He was pretty tall, wearing all black, and I couldn't make out any features. I got out of my truck, ordering him to stop, but he didn't. I slow jogged to make up some distance. When I got within about 20 yards of him, I pulled my gun and said, "Police! Stop now!" And he didn't stop. Instead, his head did a full 180-degree turn, looking right at me. His body still faced forward, walking. He had this menacing grin, ear to ear, and white eyes. It scared me so badly, I fell backwards into a puddle. As I looked up, ready to fight for my life, the man was gone. But there was nothing out there but desert for miles and miles. He couldn't have made it back to the building either. Not that fast. After a few minutes, I composed myself and called back to dispatch, letting them know the suspect had gotten away, and I was going to be heading away from there. As he finished that story, I got full-body chills. He said he had even more stories, but that one was one of the more mild ones. He then began another. I was dispatched to a small village about 4 hours into my region. I didn't anticipate making it home that night, so I packed up some food for dinner. Would likely be camping. After a 4-hour journey, I made it to the village. To the east of the village, about 100 yards out, was a red rock cliff. I met up with the man who called. He informed me that a man in traditional clothing, riding a horse, carrying a lever-action rifle, was on the ridge, and he had been shooting at them. He eventually took off on his horse. So I did what I was trained to do. I got my backpack, my rifle, and I started to track the hoof prints. I followed them for about 3 miles before I came upon a large Joshua tree, really a massive tree. From a distance, using my binoculars, I saw a man standing under the tree, and I mean he was just standing there. I approached as slowly as I could from that far out. By the time I made it to him, moving slowly and stealthily, the sun had gone down and a full moon had risen. The full moon illuminated things just enough to see, but not enough to see everything I needed to. From about 20 yards away, I called out to the man under the tree, telling him that he was surrounded. He wasn't, and he needed to surrender himself. 30 minutes went by like that. No answer, no movement at all. I decided I would bite the bullet and rush him, try to take him by surprise. I did so with my rifle in hand, pointing at the dark mass of a man in the shadows. As I approached, more details became apparent. The man was dead. He died leaning against the tree, holding his rifle. There was no horse in sight. Even more confusing, he had been dead for several days. To this very day, I'm not sure who it was who shot at the village, but I wonder if it was some kind of spirit leading me back to his body. And this is the final story he told me. In this one, he was responding to a gas station robbery on the res. It took him about 20 minutes to get on the scene. Supposedly, the gas station attendant decided he wanted to take care of justice himself and blasted the robber. When he arrived on the scene, the man had been dead for a few minutes already. Someone was giving him CPR in the parking lot. As he approached, he swears he saw a black shadow rise out of the man, similarly to how a man might get up off the ground. However, once it was standing up, it darted very quickly away from the scene. He could see it running like a shadow against the wall. Witnesses reported the man was acting very strangely, almost possessed. Before long, medical showed up on the scene, pronouncing the man dead. That one left him with some questions. He says he always assumed it was some sort of evil spirit leaving his body. This man told me many stories, which hopefully I can share another time. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.